So you've moved around quite a bit in your academic career after finishing your PhD at Berkeley. Then you went to Taiwan for a while. Then you moved to City University in Hong Kong. You came to La Trobe University when I was there as well, and were there for quite a few years. And then after that, you shifted to NTU in Singapore. Do you want to speak a little about the motivations for all the moves?
Sure, yeah, I mean, it seems, there could be a number of reasons for it, but my main reason for moving, with Hong Kong, it was partly financial, because like I said, we knew we'd never be able to afford a house, and housing was quite difficult in Taiwan. Whereas in Hong Kong, they paid me 4 times as much as in Taiwan. So that was a small consideration. But for me, the important thing was when I first went to Hong Kong, and like I said, the last talk I gave in Taiwan, I only had 4 people in the audience, whereas the first talk I gave at City U, there were people from all over Hong Kong that came to listen, and there was like 35 or more people, and it was really a very nice discussion. And this is what I always found really important about academia, is having interaction and discussion and exchanging ideas. This has always been really key thing for me. And so this is also why I left Hong Kong, because after being in Hong Kong for 8 years, the kind of situation changed where there was almost nobody I could talk to. There was one guy in translation who was Hallidayan, and so I could at least talk to him about Hallidayan type stuff. But other people were mainly formalists, and I just really didn't feel any kinship in terms of talking with them. And there were other factors about what was going on in Hong Kong in terms of them talking about merging the universities and whatnot. But it was again serendipitous that I went on sabbatical, and I went to the Research Center for Linguistic Typology. Bob Dixon invited me to visit there.
At the ANU in Canberra, right?
First, that was in 1998. I went to ANU in Canberra, but in 2000 I think it was, I went to, he was already in La Trobe, and so I visited for 6 months or a year, I forget now. But it was just an incredibly productive time. I think I wrote 11 papers, and got just so much done in a short period of time that I was at RCLT, and it was just so much interaction and with everybody there. I just really loved it. It was like paradise, all these people who are, because in Australia it's almost all, our kind of linguistics. There's almost no formal linguistics at all.
Yes, it was a dynamic place to be, wasn't it?
It was really good in the beginning. And so then I went back to Hong Kong, and Bob wrote to me and said, there's a chair professor position open here, why don't you apply for it? So then I applied for it, and I got that, and then went to, in 2002 or 2004, I went back to La Trobe to work. And
2004?
2004, yeah. 2002 is when I visited. 2004 is when I went to work. So I was there for 7 years, I think. And then the situation again changed once the leader this is what always happens, is the management of the university changed, because originally the management of the university was really good to linguistics. We were at a university level research center, and we had all kinds of funding and postdocs and PhD students and whatnot that we could decide on our own instead of having to fight with everybody else for them.
Yes.
But this, of course, generated a lot of envy, and so they eventually brought all that down and closed all of those research centers, all the humanities research centers. Once the leadership changed, it became quite unpleasant after a while, and so I was offered a research grant and kind of professorship at the Academia Sinica again starting 2012. Actually, it was supposed to start 2011, but they wouldn't give me leave. La Trobe wouldn't give me leave because they were trying to get me to quit. They wanted to close down linguistics altogether, and so I made them happy by saying, okay, I'm out of here. And so I left, and they closed down Linguistics. Now they've rebuilt it again, but from scratch. But at that time, the dean wanted to close it down because he felt that it was a threat to anthropology's dominance. Because we actually, during the research evaluation that Australia did, this excellence in research for Australia,
Yes.
We actually came out the highest in Latrobe, and he was pissed off about that. So he'd always had it in for linguistics because there was too much of a threat to he was from archaeology and wanted archaeology to be the number one dominant field in the university or something. But anyway, so I left there and I went to Taiwan. It was supposed to be a 2-year stint, again, just doing research. And that would have been great. But then when KK Luke, I actually, again on sabbatical, I'd gone in 2010, I think it was, I went to Singapore on sabbatical it was only a 6-week stay actually in Singapore, but I really enjoyed it and got along with everybody well. You were there at the time. And so I went back, and then I got the fellowship in Taiwan. But after KK heard that I was leaving Latrobe, I was retiring from Latrobe, he said, "Oh no, you got to come here. You don't go to Taiwan. Come here." And especially because B had this eye problem, they wanted somebody to come in as head of the department. So I said, no, I want to do this fellowship first. I really need to get this book written. I was still focusing on trying to write the damn book about the creation of meaning.
Yes.
And so I said, I want to get this book written. And he originally agreed, but then when Dory found out what salary they were going to give me in Singapore, she said, no, you're going to Singapore now. She said, forget about your research, you just go to Singapore. And so I had to leave after, 4 or 5 months, something like that. But I got a lot of work there in that short time.
Yeah, I'm very glad you came. We were very productive
So,
there, a little group, looking at language documentation and typology and things like that.
Right. So I was then at Singapore and National Nanyang Technological University for 9 years. And then when I was retiring from there, this Beijing Normal University, an old friend of mine, Fuelan, had talked to me years ago about going there and creating a platform for typological studies. And so she said, okay, once you retire, you come over. So we worked that out, and so I just moved. And it was supposed to, it was really basically almost like a paid retirement, because I was planning to do my research anyway, but they were going to just allow me to have this position and not have to teach or anything, just do my research.
Nice.
And so I said, sure, okay, let's do that. Dory really wanted to just retire completely, but I really like the interactive. Again, it's all really about interaction. So when I went to Latrobe, it was about interaction, but then Latrobe got weird, so then I went to Singapore, where I thought there was really a nice department where everybody was getting along and there was a lot of interaction and a lively environment. But again, things change, as the management changes and whatnot. And so at each time, it's about the environment, the interactive environment. In China now is an incredibly interactive environment for linguistics, because first of all, there are thousands of linguists in China. And second of all, they are really very active in terms of talks and conferences, and there's always something going on, and they're really well attended because there's so many people. I mean, I gave a talk. The talk I gave on non-structural linguistics, I think there were 600 people listening or something like
quite
that.
an audience.
Yeah, so it's really the interactive aspect of it is quite strong. So I really like that part, and they're really open to new ideas. So I feel like a lot more people have kind of accepted my way of looking at things, and I can work with them also in terms of Chinese. And I got a small group that we're trying to look at how applying constructionists are really more radically than constructionist approach to Chinese, to see if it will give us any insights that we wouldn't get from applying a structuralist analysis. And so this is really what has motivated me. So even like when I left Hong Kong for Australia, I mean, people thought I was crazy because I had a really high salary and housing subsidy and everything else in Hong Kong, and my salary and income generally dropped by about 2/3 when I went to Australia. But it was really, for me, the environment was just that important, that I really wanted to have that collegiality and the ability to talk to people, and so many people, like, the RCLT, people don't realize that, how big the RCLT was. That building, when it was full, was like 36 people or so, all working on similar types of projects. And so the synergy was just amazing, we had all kinds of activities, and you could learn from each other constantly, and just chat with people. And we also had, of course, our weekly meetings where we could put up our data and kibitz, people could help you, figure out your data.
And confess what we hadn't done.
Confess how much you'd done or not done over the week. That aspect, I don't know how much that really helped, but at least it kept the fire under your buns.
Indeed.
It forced you to do something. Because it is true that people in these research institutes can get lazy and don't. I once was told by somebody that actually a study was done to show that people who are teaching actually produce more than people who are in pure research positions, because they're forced to manage their time differently.
I remember you telling me that.
Yeah, because I found this myself, that you whatever you're doing fills your time, and so it's very easy when you're if you're like in your research position to do a lot of stuff that maybe not really important but spend a lot of time. It's nice to have maybe like my databases and stuff like that took a lot of time, and it's nice to have them. It really was very important in a sense to have them, because it helped me produce a lot of papers. But if I was teaching, probably I would not have had the time to do that type of thing. I would have just done some other way.
You want to talk a little now about where you're going, because you're developing a theory about communication and the way it's achieved.
Right.
And this has been very influential in your recent work.
Right. So basically this idea of the creation of meaning, as I mentioned, from Chinese, learning that language, again, it wasn't something I started out to create a theory. It's just from working with Chinese and other languages and seeing how is it possible that the communication can work in Chinese the same way it works in English, when the languages are so radically different in terms of the way they're structured. And so it's not really about the language itself, it's really about inferring the speaker's intention. And so then this leads to other aspects like understanding habit, understanding the constraints on the interpretation, and how language develops as a way of speakers trying to constrain the hearer's interpretation of their intention. And languages differ, of course, in how they do that, and that's why I came up with this three kind of questions that you ask when you're either describing a language or doing typology. It's all based on the idea that language constrains the interpretation of the inference. And it grew into just looking at human behavior generally, the habit aspect of it, so many ways, and the students really appreciated this, how when I make them do these assignments, to pay attention to their own meaning creation and also their own interactions with other people, and how they infer people's intentions and whether they get it right or not, and if they don't get it right, why did they not get it right? What assumptions are they putting into their context of interpretation that led them to think the wrong way? And then particularly humor, when you're creating humor, how does it, because basically what happens with humor is you a lot of times you have the so-called garden path type thing where you create one context of interpretation, but then you find out at the end that you have to create a totally different one, and it's unexpected. Yeah. So there's this expectedness aspect, but there's also the idea that you're doing more inferential work. And as I mentioned earlier, we enjoy doing things that help us to survive. And so just like we enjoy having sex, we enjoy eating, we enjoy doing inference. And so this is why literature, poetry, and humor, because these are unlike communication, with normal communication, where you try to minimize the person's effort for inference. You want them to be able to understand easily. With these three, you actually give them more inferential work, and they enjoy that. They feel good when they can figure it out. Of course, if they can't figure it out, then it feels uncomfortable. Yeah. But if you get the joke, if you can understand the metaphors or the intertextual references or whatever in the literature, or with particularly something like poetry, where there's all these extended inferences that you can get, because you can have multiple layers of inferences. You can have primary inferences and secondary inferences, and we often use this in pragmatics. In our interactions. So, like if a guy asks a girl, "Would you like to go to the movie on Saturday?" and she says, "I have a test the next morning," then that could be the main inference that the guy has to draw is that she can't go to the movie that night, right? So he has to infer that saying "I have a test in the morning" is her answer to his question. It's not just something random.
It's got relevance.
It's relevant somehow. So figuring out the relevance of that, and then the secondary thing is that if it wasn't for the test, she would go out with him. So it saves his face by doing that. Now she can reinforce that secondary one by saying, "How about another night?" Yeah. But if it's really that she's just doing it as a face-saving thing, then she would just stop there and just let him think that it's only because of the test, but otherwise he would. But it may be that she doesn't want to go out with him, but she's just using this as a face-saving thing. So there's really intricate things going on when we interact, and it's not in the language. It's in our interpretation of the person's intention of the language. And so the deeper you get into this, and then the implications for philosophy and anthropology, and because meaning, as I said, is not in anything. We create all of the meaning. When I see this and I say that's a bed, or I say that's a camera, or whatever, all that meaning is created in my mind. It's all my way of thinking, my way of categorizing the world and talking about things. And so it's really very relevant to so many different fields, this way of looking at it, because in the past people have thought all meaning was in words and sentences, and so this is particularly with formalists that they assume all of the meaning is in the words there, and so they would have these very complicated things like just like if you remember the performative hypothesis of the generative semanticists, where if you just said like, "It's raining," and you mean it as a warning, then they would say, well, covertly there's a thing saying, "I'm warning you, it's raining." And of course that's not there. It's all just inference. Yes. But in those days, particularly the Chomskyan way of doing it, everything had to be in the form. So that's why we call them formalists, partly because everything is explained by the form itself. But that's certainly not the case, and the same words can be used in different contexts with totally different meanings. Even with different, this is another aspect, is you can't look at language without sound, but this is something Halliday and Bill Graves talked about. They have a book on this, that words have meaning because of the sound you put into it. So if, how you say a word is going to affect how the person interprets your intention in using that word. And so looking at syntax without the prosody and whatnot is really missing a lot of what's going on there. So there's this written bias in linguistics because a lot of linguistics came from philology where they're looking at written text, but it's also just, I guess, easy to work with written data. But with natural, this is why I always insist on natural spoken data, because it's just really so much richer, and not just the spoken aspect, but you videotape it because the gestures are important. This is why we have emoji. Emoji are replacing the face because the face is so important in communication.
Yeah, they're filling a need, aren't they?
Yeah, they're filling a need, just like punctuation. So punctuation was, originally writing didn't have punctuation, and people found it very hard to read. So punctuation is a replacement for intonation. So where you put your pauses and things like that. So that's really important to our inference of what the person is talking about, is where the pauses are and whatnot, because that helps us to try to infer the person's intention in what they wrote. So intonation was the first thing where they are trying to replace. Punctuation is trying to replace intonation, and then now we can do these emoji or emoticon. Back in the 19th century, they already had emoticon to show a facial expression, or sometimes we use this XXOO for kiss and hug. But the idea is things that you can't normally express in writing. You use these, in Japanese it's just called picture writing. In emoji, emoji actually means picture writing. Emoji means picture writing. So you're using this, but it's not really a different writing system. It's really just replacing the expressions of the face that we would have if we were in face-to-face interaction, because that's so important to our understanding of the person's intentions. And so this is why emojis have almost become obligatory now, to help people infer, when you are making a joke, when you're being serious, or when you're being happy, or whatever. These things are important. So when you do documentation, it's really important to get the whole thing. I know myself from experience that in the past, I would just use a tape recorder, especially when you had to climb mountains and stuff, and video cameras were very big in those days.
Yes.
I would just carry a small tape recorder. And sometimes you'd go back, and sometimes years later, you try to listen to something, and then they talk about, it was about this long, and and this high, and you have no idea what they're talking about.
Yeah, video is a great addition to a documentation.
So I found video to be really important in not just the gestures, but the facial expressions, and even seeing how their mouth moves, because we, as you saw from the McGurk effect, right? It's important to see the person speaking, and because it helps us to infer what sound is thing. So again, even just understanding what sound somebody's producing is an inferential type of thing, that we're basing it on several different clues, like how they see their mouths going, but also it's not just the sound alone, it's also inference from seeing their mouth move in a particular way.
Useful for transcribing difficult sounds as well.
Yeah. So that was one thing because I had, for example, one of these double sounds in Qiang where they have two different plosions at the same time. And so Peter said you have to videotape it. Peter Ladefoged, I asked him about it, and he said you have to videotape it, but I ended up never doing that, unfortunately. It wasn't that significant. It wasn't like phonemic or anything. And when I talk about the creation of meaning, what I actually talk about, aside from the inferential part and the habit part and whatnot, is I found it really important, and I was just talking about how important prosody is. And one of the reasons why prosody is important is because the function of structure actually is, to a large extent, is information packaging,
Yeah.
and, information structure. And so one of the key things that actually the reason why grammatical structures grammaticalize the way they do is to express a particular information packaging, information structure. And the prosody in English, at least, prosody is the key way that we mark information structure. Other languages may do it with word order or other features, but English, because English uses word order to mark grammatical mood and grammatical relations, it's not really available for information structure. You can't be quite as fluid. I mean, there are some inversion things, like there was a lady who lived in a shoe, that type of thing, these existential clauses, but they are kind of minority. But unlike in Chinese, where it's a very frequent thing to use word order to mark, topical versus non-topical elements. And so information structure I found to be very important to language, and part of the whole package, and looking at it as the motivation. I mean, I have an article in Linguistic Typology that you really need to look at causality, because one of the problems I have with modern typology is they're not interested in causality. They're only interested in the form by itself. Whereas, like what you were talking about, the metaphorical underpinnings of the structures, and also how these can be affected in language contact, these are really important questions, and in understanding why something conventionalizes the way it does, for me, one of the key functions of it is information structure, but it's also, like you said, in many cases, manifesting a particular metaphor, as Heine also talked about. And then the other aspect is this constructionist approach, because words really don't have meaning by themselves. They only have meaning in a particular context, and so this is why I think the constructionist approach is so important. And going back actually to role and reference grammar, back when I first started learning that was a key insight that helped me understand grammatical relations, was looking at it from a constructionist point of view rather than from a global point of view. And so generally typology now doesn't look at languages globally. Generally modern typology looks at constructions. And also language development is based on constructions. Like kids also generally learn constructions first and then take them apart and learn the individual things. So these aspects to me all kind of fit together into a more empirical, I think, way of approaching language documentation and typology. And so, and it's also allows the freedom of discovering diversity, which is really what I'm about, and one of the reasons why I differ with a lot of the typologists who are really just interested in lumping things together and calling them universals. Whereas for me, I'm interested in the fine details of the diversity of how, okay, sure, we have these comparative concepts where we all express maybe certain types of ideas or concepts, but there are so many different ways of expressing that. Degrees to which we express it, and what particular mechanism, and whether or not we express it at all. And so there should be no assumptions at all. When you do a language, you work completely inductively from the data and identify the patterns and what they're doing. And so my article in 2016 or 17 in Language Typology was arguing that we need to focus on causality. Why are the structures the way they are, right? Try to explain that's an important aspect, but a lot of typologists don't really agree with that. They don't think causality is important. It's just you look at the structure and you don't really care where it came from, or why it is the way it is. But it's like for Hasselmath and Dreyer, they separate grammar and parole. So very much like Chomsky, they separate the two, whereas Chomsky though looks at grammar in the mind, and that's what he's interested in, whereas they look only at parole and they don't care about the grammar in the mind. I don't separate the two at all. What is spoken is the language, right? But there is a cognitive motivation for the speaker to use those particular words in that particular context with that particular person. And so you want to understand that. So this is then of course leading into interactional linguistics. So this is why there's really a confluence of all of these different things. So you need, the problem with interaction linguistics is they spend so much time really fine detailed kind of transcription. It takes so much time. And so a lot of times when they do a presentation, they can only show you a very short couple of seconds of something. And you can draw some conclusions about that, but you can't really make generalizations off of small amounts of data like that. So you have to have a middle ground somewhere in terms of your transcription. You certainly want intonation in there somehow, but you have to be able to do it in a way that's manageable, that you can get enough data to be able to analyze it in a way that you can make solid generalizations about the constructions of the language.
So we started with you talking about how you wandered your way into linguistics, your time in Berkeley, the influences like Derek Bickerton, and then you've talked quite a lot about the various places that you moved to, the philosophy behind your research, and also the influences on your current thinking and the work that you're doing now, particularly looking at how meaning is created in the minds of not only speakers but also addressees. So thanks so much for sharing so much of your life with us, Randy.
Well, thank you very much for initiating this and asking the questions. I enjoyed it.
Good. Thank you.